Good evening. I'm Beth Keller, and I'd like to welcome you to Library in Your Living Room, our series of virtual programs. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're very excited to welcome Ellen Feldman as part of the library's ongoing Meet the Author series. She's joining us tonight from New York to discuss her new book, Paris Never Leaves You. Ellen is the author of more than 7 books and was a Guggenheim Fellow. Paris Never Leaves You was published in August and was a CNN Best Books pick for August. Library Journal gave the book a starred review and had this to say. They called it an engrossing tale of identity, survival, loyalty, and love. Ellen will be joined this evening by Chicago-based discussion facilitator Alice Moody for an in-conversation event. Paris Never Leaves You is available in paperback, and signed copies can be purchased from the bookstall. They can be mailed to your home, they can be picked up from the store, or they can be picked up from the library. When ordering, just indicate that you would like to pick up from the Highland Park Library, whether you're ordering from the phone or online. And we'll share the bookstall's contact information on the screen. Before I turn it over to Ellen and Alice, please note that as an attendee tonight, your camera and microphones are turned off. We'll conclude the program tonight with questions and answers, and those can be asked by typing questions in the chat box. The chat box is turned off now, but it will be enabled towards the end of the program, and you can type your questions in the chat box. To open the chat box, you'll find an icon at the bottom of your screen that says chat, and click on that, and you can start typing your question. I'm now going to turn it over to Ellen and Alice. Thank you.
Thank you. It would help if I unmute myself. Hi, Ellen. Thank you so much for being here. Hello, everyone out there who we cannot see, but we're happy that you're here. And before we get into the questions, Ellen, would you mind reading an excerpt from, I'm holding up your book for everyone, Paris Never Leaves You, although is it right behind your right shoulder as well?
It's right there too. We're all prepared. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. The only thing better would be being there myself, because I love the Chicago area. That would be great fun. But okay, I'm going to read part of the prologue to the book. Much of the book is set in Paris, or part of it is set in Paris under the occupation. And this scene takes place after the liberation of Paris. So after 4 years of horror occupied by the Nazis, August 25th, 1944, Allied troops liberated the city. And we've all seen the stills and the clips of champagne bottles popping and everybody cheering the weary Allied soldiers and women kissing them and hugging them and whatnot, and the men looking kind of weary but sheepish. And they're wonderful scenes. However, this scene takes place several days or perhaps weeks later, because that was euphoria. And after that, some revenge began to set in. And this is the dark underbelly of liberation. As I said, revenge started to set in. The French, there was really no war in France. The French army was defeated immediately. I'm not saying there wasn't suffering. The suffering was terrible, but the French army was humiliated. And they, unfortunately, after the war, many of the men took this out on French women. As many men collaborated with the Nazis as women did, but for some reason, well, not for some reason, it was a way to restore their own self-worth. They took it out on the women who had collaborated. Now, the Vichy government, the collaborationist government, was all men. Women didn't even get the vote until after the war, in France, until after the war. So they were not the only collaborators, but they were the scapegoats. And many of them, they had their head shaved, as you'll hear in this scene, and many of them were abused very badly, and some were even murdered. It was a terrible, terrible time. So I will read to you part of the prologue. The protagonist is Charlotte. She's a young widow with an infant daughter, and her daughter is Vivi. And this is a scene in Paris, in the streets of Paris, after the liberation. Charlotte did not want to watch, but neither could she tear herself away. She stood riveted to the spot, mesmerized by the hatred, immobilized by the fear. They had stripped the woman down to her brassiere and underpants, threadbare graying straps of dignity or modesty or some barely remembered decency from better times. The brassiere was torn at the nipple. Whether from current violence or past passion was impossible to tell. An old man with a tobacco-stained beard reached out a filthy hand and pinched the pink flesh. The crowd roared its delight. A young man brandishing a rifle used it to prod the woman first one way, then the other, until she was stumbling on the high heels she was still wearing. The shoes made her nakedness more obscene. As she lurched, the crowd caught sight of a brown stain on the seat of her torn underpants. Again, it was impossible to tell whether it was the sign of current terror or past slovenliness, but the jeering grew louder. It drowned out the sound of the church bell that had begun to toll and continued after the bell went silent. It was only 2 o'clock. Collabo, a woman in the crowd, howled. Collabo horizontal, another screamed, and the women in the mob took up the cries and passed them around as they would under other circumstances have handed a baby from one to the other. Both instincts were primitive and protective, though in this case only of self. Only the hardest or most forgetful of them, those who had never given a civil hello to a billeted soldier or uttered a merci for a door held, could fail to see themselves in place of that woman, huddled in shame as her hair fell to the ground in greasy clumps. Her days of black market meat and eggs and shampoo were long gone. The women in the pack howled their rage, but the men, especially the silent men, were more dangerous, and not only because they brandished the rifles and wielded the shears and razors. The men reeked of sexual malice. Some of them clutched their crotches as they heckled and punched and kicked the woman. Others sweated and smirked and wiped the spittle from their mouths with the back of their hands, then ran their tongues over their lips as if they could taste the thrill. Their country had been defeated. They had been humiliated. But this wreaking of vengeance, this rendering of justice, this half-naked woman stained with blood and tears and feces made them men again. Holding Vivi tighter, Charlotte began pushing her way through the mob. Drunk now on justice, and the wine an enterprising woman had begun selling, but not yet satiated, the crowd pushed back, urging her to stay, sneering at her for her tenderheartedness, taunting her for her lack of patriotism. She put her hand on the back of Vivi's head to shield her and kept going. At the edge of the crowd, a woman from the camp stopped her. "You can't leave," she said, and pointed to a group of women and one man in a corner, waiting in the corner of the square, waiting for their turn with the tondeur. "It's not over." Charlotte shook her head. "As long as this goes on, it never will be," she said, and kept going. The woman stood looking after her. "Holier than thou, that one," she observed to no one in particular. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's as though we're there with Charlotte watching that scene. It's so vivid. I felt that way the entire time. Congratulations on this novel. It was, I know this is not an adjective, but it really was unputdownable. I felt so vested in Charlotte and Vivi and all of the characters. I really, when it ended, I was like, why did I read that so fast? It was one of those novels you wish you sort of savored a little more, but you can always go back. I kept thinking as I was reading it, I think because I facilitate so many different book discussions, there's so much to discuss. There's so many different layers and moral quagmires and what you will. So anyway, congratulations on this novel. I wanted to start by asking you, I'm sure several people in the audience, many of us have read novels set during World War II. And what I loved about your story is I feel like we're looking at the war, at least the period that's in the war, through a different lens. So can you share what you think distinguishes your story from other novels that are depicting the same period of time?
Yeah, well, I'll try to. I was interested, Charlotte, the character of Charlotte's book is built on the character of Charlotte, and Charlotte was inspired by women who were nothing like her. I did not want to write about the war, and I didn't want to write about the camps either. I wanted to stay there. I mean, I think there's wonderful body of literature on that, but I didn't want to go there, and I also had other concerns. And as I said, the inspiration for Charlotte were women who were nothing like her. In my reading of the books about the period, straight histories, memoirs, biographies, which I read for research, but also for pleasure. I just am fascinated by the era. I came across many women who had spied for the Allies or fought in the resistance or risked their lives in a variety of ways to help defeat the enemy. And I started thinking, what about ordinary women? What about women who were not blessed or cursed with this kind of courage? In other words, what about a woman like me? It's essentially the beginning of this. What would she do to save herself? And once I started thinking about that, I thought, what would she do to save her child? How far will she go? So the first question was, what moral compromises would she make? Second was, would she be able to justify them to herself, or how would she justify them? And then the really important question was, okay, she survives. How does she live with that for the rest of her life? How does she deal with the compromises she made?
Yeah. So many, that's why it's such a great book club book, because there is all of this. I read this quote in Quill Inquirer, I think is how you pronounce it. It's Canada's Publishers Weekly, if you will. And the quote says, history tells us what people do. Historical fiction helps us imagine how they felt. And I love that quote. I'm curious, how do you bridge this gap between reading about history and then creating a character like Charlotte or characters of this time period? I guess I'm really asking about your craft. What's your process? How do you go from reading to creating?
It's trying to describe your process. I think it's a little like tying your shoes when you're thinking, how do I tie a shoe? Because it's not really, I mean, it is conscious, obviously. You make notes and I do rough outlines. When I used to teach, and I don't believe you can teach creative writing, I used to say that of course you must start with an outline or you'd be writing yourself in circles for an entire time. But I said at the end of it, if you have a novel that adheres to the original outline, you have a dead novel on your hands. It has to take off. It has to be a living thing. I think what happens is once I've done the research and start to think about the characters, and here, as I said, Charlotte was the inspiration for this, or the foundation of it, you begin living with them in your head. And they're as real to you as the people. Well, first of all, I'm a writer, so I spend a lot of time alone, but they're as real to you as the people in your life whom you see during the day. Years ago, I wrote a novel, and Scottsboro, and the protagonist was a barely literate Southern woman. I would slip into her dialect sometimes that I didn't even know I was doing it. It was really strange. So you essentially, for the time, my process anyway, is I write all the time. And I mean, I don't write for a few months and then stop. I write. And so I'm essentially immersed in that world.
Thank you. I know. I want to talk about, so there's not just this occupied Paris, but then we get into the 1950s in the New York City publishing world. And I read that is a world that you were part of at a certain period. And I'm curious, what part of your experience made its way into the novel, and how did that inform Charlotte's years with Vivi in New York?
It definitely did inform it. I had worked in publishing several decades later. By then, publishing had changed quite a bit, but human nature doesn't change, as we all know. And I found in the beginning, Charlotte was not going to work in publishing. The women I had read about, or when I was very small met, who would come here as immigrants, tended to go into either fashion or beauty. I mean, that's what we associated with them. That's what I thought Charlotte was going to do. And I found out, again, maybe this is projection, that Charlotte, she's a French woman, so she has style, but she didn't want to do that. And she had worked in a bookshop in Paris. And I thought, no, she'll get a job in publishing. She'll find a way. And once I made that decision, my own experiences began coming back to me. And some of the characters in the publishing house are definitely inspired by people I worked with. And some of her experiences are, I mean, there's this very minor moment there in the book where she has published a mystery, and the books come from the printer, and there's no last page in the mystery. It's missing. The print there, so we don't know who done it. And when I was working in a publishing house, sure enough, a print run came out and there was no last page. So, and the character, the various characters, I mean, the sales manager or the head of production is reputed to have mafia connections. Well, there was always gossip like that in our publishing house, but you believe some of it and not others. But it was fun revisiting it. It really was. And sometimes I had to scale back because real life characters are sometimes too broad for fiction. I mean, one of the characters, who's not a particularly likable person here, he had at least three martini lunches a week. And I had to take that out because it just made him too broad a character.
He was too much a caricature. It's funny how real life can sometimes not seem real.
Yes, exactly.
In terms of, oh wait, I did want to ask you one more thing about the publishing. Have you heard from anyone in that publishing world that you were part of all those years ago who has read Paris Never Leaves You, who has given you some feedback or input on your
one woman wrote and said, "Is this so-and-so?" And I said, "Inspiration." I would say the other character that I'd be happy to own up to is as you know, the publisher here is a man in a wheelchair who's been wounded in the war. And the editor-in-chief of the house where I worked was in a wheelchair and had been wounded in the war. Now, he is not this character because I did not have an affair with him or anything like that. He was a happily married older man, but he was such a wonderful man and a wonderful editor. And in fact, it's because of him, partially, that I'm a writer. Because when I was working in the publishing house, I was doing publicity and I was terrible at it. And he said to me one day, "Why don't you quit and go home and write a novel of your own? Stop repeating others." And I couldn't just walk out on a job, but it stayed in my head. And I'm very grateful to him.
Yes, Horace was one of my favorite characters in the novel. That was, right, Horace?
I'm so glad, because the women react very differently to him. Some are crazy about him and some are not.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue into my next question. So I read a review that said, one of the things I enjoyed most about the novel was Feldman's creation of well-rounded characters. Charlotte, despite all her admirable qualities, her resilience, intelligence, and ability to roll a wicked French R when the situation calls for it, is still a deeply flawed character. The Germans, too, aren't simply depicted as mindless villains. So I'm curious, is making a well-rounded character sort of a goal of yours? Is that something you're consciously doing? Or is that just how you view people, that you're looking at all parts of human nature and how people act?
I think that's an interesting question. It's both of those things. I think as a novelist, you look at people and you try to figure out their motives. Sometimes people do very generous things for somewhat selfish reasons. We all do, not people, And the other thing is I find myself sometimes pulling back with a character because it's partly, you don't want to make a character, real fear is making a character so evil that he or she is unbelievable. But you also don't want to make a character so good that he or she becomes saccharine and really boring, really boring. Years ago, I got from an editor, one of my first editors, I got a wonderful piece of advice that I always keep in mind. I was struggling with a scene and I was in his office, we were talking about it, and he said, "Try writing it backwards." And I said, "What do you mean, from the end of the scene to the beginning?" Because Mary McCarthy does that in a book. He said, "No, write it from the opposite emotion." And often as a writer, or this writer, I will draw to a response that I might have to something. And I have to stop and say, what is the other, somebody might have the opposite response to that. Instead of getting angry at the other character in the scene, she might pull herself back for self-protective reasons or something like this. And so I'm always kind of trying not to go for the obvious response, or to, if I write the obvious response, to look at it and say, no, she has to take a different stand here.
And how do you know at what moments during the writing that you do need to pull back? And is it just intuitive now over time that you're aware when you're doing that?
Sometimes you know it while you're writing the scene. More often, there are two other times you figure it out. One, I do a lot of my writing in a library, and when I leave it, my feet hit the street and I say, oh no, that's gotta go. Or when you go back and you start reading and you say, what was I thinking? And you want to change it then. As I said before, it's a living thing. It should be a vital thing. And so there are always changes. You know, you can do a scene write a scene one way and then write it another way and then say, no, I think the first version is more true. I've never had a manuscript that just brings full-grown first draft. I don't think any writer who has.
Right. I have this quote I love by William Trevor, who's one of my favorite writers. You've addressed this a little bit, but he says, by the end, you should be inside your character, actually operating from within somebody else and knowing him pretty well, as that person knows himself or herself. You're sort of a predator, an invader of people. So I guess if you're, have this dialect of a Southern woman when you leave the library or whatever, you've invaded that character. But do you feel you're more within all of the characters, or more you're living alongside them? And then as the second part to that question, when the novel's finished, are you like, okay, goodbye? Or do you miss these characters who you've invaded or lived alongside?
The second part of that I'll answer first. You do miss them. I mean, it's almost like a little postpartum depression after you finish the novel, but you still live with them, in your daily life. I think about Charlotte and what she's done a lot. You only stop doing that, or I stopped doing that, only when I start a new book. And then the new characters take over. The other part of that is the main characters I definitely live inside. The minor characters, you just have to know that what they're doing. But the interesting thing is there's a character in the publishing house in this who's based on a real character, who was she was a terrible name dropper, and she was so annoying to work with. But when I started to write a minor character based on her, I suddenly became more compassionate. Why was she doing this? And of course I could have figured it out then, but who wanted to while she's sitting there dropping names? But when you start to write her, you think, oh, how sad that she felt she had to do this for people to like her or be interested in her. So yeah, you weasel your way into a character quite a bit.
So maybe if we all became writers, we'd have more compassion for other people then, a little bit, right?
I'd love to think that's true. I'm not sure.
I'm not sure.
It's hard.
I'm not sure it's true either. I read, I love this. I read something you published in Tablet magazine about individuals of Jewish descent who served in the Nazis, or who served the Nazis. And you wrote, it would be easy from the distance of close to a century to condemn those Jews who fought for a bestial regime sworn to exterminate the Jewish people. Certainly many of their contemporaries did. But for those of us who were not there, Hillel the Elder's words serve as a warning. Do not judge your fellow human beings until you've stood in their shoes. I wanted to ask you about that, because you certainly have this character, Hannah, who does judge in the book. But even more, I'm curious, what do you think is the role of a reader? Because I read these discussions and everyone has different reactions. Do you think as a reader that we should be judging characters? We should be judging their actions? Should we be open-minded? What are your thoughts about that?
That's an interesting question too. I think the role, well, first of all, the role of the reader is to enjoy herself and to have a good time with the book and get inside it and live it. I think people do judge. I would rather they question. I mean, one of one of the points of this book is that the Hillel the Elder epigraph is, you can't judge someone until you have been in that person's place. And I agree with you that I think there are so many opinions about this book, and I've heard book clubs really arguing about it. I think the interesting thing is to figure out, it's easy to say, oh, Charlotte did this, I like it, or I don't like it, or I think it's terrible, or I think it's okay. I think it's much more interesting to consider, well, if I had been in Charlotte's place, what would I do? As I said, what moral compromises will you make? What corners will you cut to save a child? That's a really difficult question. And of course, we can't answer it unless we've lived in that situation. But I think it's an interesting question to ask yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it takes a certain open-mindedness to be a reader, because so many people say, oh, I don't like that character's actions, I don't care about their character anymore, or I'm not, that's not for me because I would never do that, right? So I think it almost takes not compassion, but like, wait, exactly what you said, questioning, wait, what would I do if I was in her shoes? In Publishers Weekly, it says, a dangerous secret gives Feldman's story a gasp-worthy spin. So I don't want to give any spoilers away, because I hope everyone watching who hasn't read your novel will buy it and read your novel. But did you know the gasp-worthy spin before you began? Or when you came up with this gasp-worthy, I just like saying gasp-worthy spin.
That's a great phrase.
Were you like, oh, this is excellent, I can't, what was the process of coming to that big moment?
I did not know it when I started the book. I knew what I wanted to write about, as I said, the issues and the story. I do a lot of research and writing in a subscription library in my neighborhood here in Manhattan. And it has open stacks. I love open stacks because you go looking for one book, which you've looked up, and invariably your eye catches something else on the shelf, and it's even more interesting. So I went down to the history section. I was looking for a book about France under the occupation one afternoon, and a title, I won't say what it is because it will give away the thing. Right. A title caught my eye, and I thought it was a play on words, and I thought it's a very tasteless play on words, and not dirty, just immorally tasteless. And I opened it up, and I was fascinated. I could not believe it. I had never heard of this, and some professional historians I know had never heard of it. I ended up sitting down on the floor in the stacks and reading. 2 hours later, I came out of the stacks, went back up to my laptop at the top floor of the library, and the book had been altered entirely. One character had been deepened entirely, and several moral issues had risen from this. So it was a wonderful discovery from my point of view, because for me, it made the issues more intriguing, and I think the book more interesting.
Yeah, I would agree with that as a reader. Can you talk a bit about your research process, and do you often wind up on the floor reading something for 2 hours, or is that an outlier event?
That's the first time that ever happened, but it is too easy to go off on tangents. The research is so much fun, and you find sometimes you get to a point where you say toward the end, you have to stop. Yes, this is an interesting topic or an interesting book, but you've got to start writing. I generally start with general histories of the period. Then I go on to biographies and memoirs and that sort of thing, and then to newspapers and magazines of the period, and they are invaluable. I mean, they're like time machines, and so you really get, and sometimes, the ads in a newspaper are as useful as what you're reading there. And then not with this book, but with some books that are set in this country, I go to the archives, and that's fun. And only once in my life, I think, did I make a discovery that had not been known. And I was so excited because I'm not a professional historian.
Right.
I was dancing out of there thinking, this is great.
What was that discovery?
That was discovered in the FDR library in Hyde Park. Most historians I can't remember the dates now, but he was in love with Lucy Mercer. And most historians date her return to the White House, her first visit to the White House, a certain date. She, in fact, was there several months earlier, but it was because of computers that this popped up there. And I said, oh boy, I discovered something.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it was really interesting. And it was the whole day, I won't go off on that, it's a different book.
Right.
The whole incident was very interesting.
I read in an interview with LitHub, you said, I've discovered a certain irony in returning to my past to write Paris Never Leaves You. I know from other novels I've written that in the future, I'll sometimes be unable to distinguish between the real people and incidents of my life and those that exist in the fiction I wrought from them. Does that blending bother you, or you're okay with it?
No, it troubles me. There's nothing I can do about it, but it troubles me because I know once I've used something in my life and turned it into fiction, and also because it's not, I said before, you go over it and over it. So, you're rewriting it, you're polishing it, then you're reading it after it's been copy edited. So it really imprints itself on your brain, perhaps more than something that happened when I was 20. And it is occasionally members of my family or somebody from my past will say, it didn't really happen that way. But of course, we all have different memories. I mean, it's, growing up, siblings, we all remember things differently from each other.
Do you find, you talked a bit about this process of saying if you were teaching writing and you made an outline and your finished story wound up just like that outline, it was probably not what you wanted. And there are all sorts of ways people describe this. I have this whole quote I won't read about being an architect or a gardener. Like, are you the architect who has the whole blueprint and everything planned out? Or are you just kind of planting the seeds and you have some idea what might sprout, but things can happen along the way. And I'm curious if you have to be a little bit more of an architect with historical fiction, even though obviously you're gardening and you're doing other things. And do you ever feel a certain pressure to, like you're bridging this gap between something that actually happened in a world that you're creating? Like, do you ever feel like I have to be true to something I read when maybe that isn't the direction you want to go in your writing?
That's fascinating. I do stay true to history. I will not change. Obviously, you can't change major events, but I won't even change characters or represent somebody as something that I don't believe that character was, just for fictional purposes because it's convenient. However, I do realize that the character that I create, or especially when I write about real characters, is my vision of that character, not the real character. And the other thing about being a gardener is that I'm definitely not an architect, because sometimes characters that I think are going to be just fine, or a scene that's going to be terrific, end up on the cutting room floor. They just don't work. And sometimes a character will slip in and take over and demand more time. And I think most writers pray for those moments, because it means the character is taking on a life of his or her own. And you just want that to happen so desperately.
Did that happen in Paris Never Leaves You with a particular character?
As I said, Charlotte changes as she goes along. I mean, she changed her profession, but she also became, I think, somewhat, she changed. That's all. I'll go into the specifics. The man, very minor character, the man who works in the hardware store.
Oh, Mr. Rosenblum?
Yes, there's a hardware store very much like that in my neighborhood. I couldn't use it because it's called Feldman's. It's not related to me. And, he's based on characters I think I knew growing up or something like that. And once he started talking to Vivi, he just became very real to me. And I love that kind of thing. And I felt quite in love with him, as did Charlotte by the end.
So you've mentioned that there's this subscription library that you belong to, and you were in the Stacks. And I've read that you do a lot of writing at the New York Public Library. How did the pandemic, or still going on, the pandemic. I don't know if libraries are reopened in New York City, but how has that impacted your writing? And are you doing more writing from home, or how has this affected you as a writer?
I'm writing entirely from home, and I miss the library. Both at the Society Library that I mentioned, there are several rooms for writers, and at the public library there are several rooms for writers. And it's funny, they're obviously very silent and very private. Public libraries, Carol's, the Society Library has some rooms and just tables. There's a camaraderie there that I love, that I didn't realize how much I valued until I lost it. In fact, when the library did open, the Society Library, and I went back to get some books, I almost started to cry. It felt so wonderful to be there. I have been working at home. The odd thing about that, I mean, obviously you're a writer, you've got your laptop, you can work anywhere, is I think I should be getting so much more work done than I am, because it's, you know, you get up in the morning and you say, oh, I have the whole day to do nothing but write. And somehow it isn't as efficient as you think, or as productive as you think.
Well, there are more distractions at home, I would think, right?
Yeah,
Speaking of writing in a library, because I ask a lot of writers, some, you know, they write a sentence or they go back, they need to hear it, they talk it. I love your dialogue. Do you talk out loud in the library, or are you quiet?
it would run me out. No, occasionally when I'm reading, and I'm at home, I will read aloud, but basically it's very silent. Mostly I think I hear these things in my head. I don't do that much reading aloud. You can hear the rhythm, or I can hear the rhythms in my head.
Interesting. You published, maybe this wasn't your first novel, because I know, Beth, before we started, you've written more, but maybe in novels. Was A Man Walks in a Room in 2002 your first novel?
I never wrote that.
Then I guess it wasn't your first novel. Oh my gosh, that's embarrassing.
Oh, that's very funny.
That's so funny. What was your first novel and what year was it?
As I said, I've had various different careers in various different kinds of books. The first one in this iteration was called Lucy, and it's about FDR and Lucy Mercer and Eleanor Roosevelt. Yeah.
What year was Lucy?
I think it was 2000. Wait a minute. It was, you know, it was 2001 or 2.
Okay, so still a good 11, 8 or 9 years ago, right?
Yes.
Okay.
No, more than that, almost 20.
2011 to
2002. No, 2000.
Oh, you say 2002? Yes. Not only do I have the wrong book, my math is a little off. Okay, so almost 2 decades ago, 20 years. I'm getting to a question here, I promise you. What advice would you give your younger writer self of 2 decades ago? What lesson have you learned along the way that you would tell your writing self from 20 years ago?
I don't think there's a big lesson. I think it took me a while to learn the syndrome, I call it. If I've learned it, you're going to read it. And when you've done so much research, it's so much, you know, you're so excited about all you know that you keep trying to ram it into the book, and it doesn't belong there. So in those days, I think I had to do several drafts just to get all the factual matter out of the way. You know, then I just keep slashing it and deleting. And I think that's the main. I mean, it's just small things. You know, you keep working on your craft. I think I'm more demanding of myself than I was there as far as sentences and that sort of thing. But there was no epiphany when suddenly I realized, oh, I was so naive then and I know better now. It's nothing like that.
Not like that. Okay. I love how you talk about, you know, not having to include everything or having to go through many drafts, because I didn't feel that way in your novel at all. But sometimes I do when I personally read historical fiction. I call it in my head information dumping. Like there's so much information there that like it takes me out of the story. And I never once experienced that. Like it all seamlessly flows into this story that's hard to put down. Did you leave any, other than historical things that maybe you edited out? Is this finished version, did you take a lot of detours along the way? Or was this kind of a straight route for you? And also I want to ask about the title. Was that always the title?
It wasn't so much detours once I got into it. Beginnings are frequently very hard for me until you know your characters. I have pages and pages of the early scene, not the prologue, that I knew had to be Paris and what had to happen. But when Charlotte gets to New York, I had a lot of trouble, and there were all sorts of horrible scenes that I found a diary where a friend had asked me, why are you having more trouble with, I had been complaining at lunch, why are you having more trouble with this book? And I couldn't put my finger on it. It was just trying to find my way into the story. No, the title was not originally the title. The title, I don't think I'm tremendously good with titles. And my St. Martin's is my editor and my publisher there are, and we had a whole bunch of back and forths about this, and somehow this came out of it.
Well, I love this woman. She kind of looks like you on the cover.
Oh, right. If only I did. But you know the funny thing, when you had it up on the screen, and I have it in my apartment here in my study, I'm beginning to think I look like her, and I know I don't, but it's so much fun.
No, I think you do. Although I saw the Australian cover too, or maybe it was Australian. It was one cover, and it was a man and woman embracing. I didn't know, was it Charlotte and Laurence or Julian? I don't know, Julian maybe. But anyway, it was a train behind them. Do you have a say in the cover art?
That was the Australian cover. The UK cover is similar to that.
Okay.
The only other foreign cover I've seen, I think, is Slovakia or something, and that's very strange to me. It's been bought in 10 other countries, but
congratulations.
I've only seen a couple of those, and you can make a fuss about a cover or a jacket. I think that's really a marketing tool, and the marketing department knows better than I do about that. And also, with foreign publishers know their audience better than I do. So I've never gone to the mat about anything. I think once I did, but my editor didn't like it either, so it was fine. I love this. I love both covers, both the Australian one and this one. I think both houses did great jobs.
Have any reactions to the novel surprised you?
Actually, there was one, I think it was a review, who said it was a very satisfying romance, and this did not strike me as a romance. I mean, the thing is, you learn, reviews, people bring their own predilections to something, and so it's fine. And if somebody enjoyed it as a romance, that's great. I'm very happy. But I really was much more interested in the moral issues at stake here. And so, you just say, well, I'm glad you liked it as a romance, and I didn't intend that, but I'm delighted.
Yeah, and even the daughter, Vivi, she has a little moral dilemma going on in New York with her friend who's cheating on a test.
Yes.
And I'm curious, did that happen? Did you have a friend who wasn't honest at school, or how'd you come up with that one?
That's interesting. I don't know how. I knew that she needed a moral conundrum. I understood that because of her father and her mother and that sort of thing. And I think that just came up because it's such a common school. Yeah. I guess I was reading about cheating on exams in the paper, saying like this. But then the solution that her mother gives her, that took a while to come to, and I'll make a confession. Okay. My husband helped me with that.
He has a little credit.
Yeah, I said, what would you do if your child came home with this? And we discussed it. And I said, that's a good idea. Thank you.
I thought it was a really good idea too. Yeah, I thought it was a great one. Okay, I have this quick fire round or lightning round, but it's really the same thing we're doing. But I have like a series of questions. And so it's just a sentence or two. And I thought we'll do it before we open it up to questions. Okay, so you ready for my lightning round? When you were little, what did you want to be when you grew up?
A writer.
fulfilled your wish. If you weren't a writer, what would you like to be?
I can't imagine that, because I really cannot imagine not being a writer is one thing, writing is something else. And if I go for too long without writing, I'm hell to live with, I'm told. So I can't imagine another career.
What's the best writing advice you've ever received? I know you talked about writing from the other point of view or the other emotion, but is there any other writing advice?
The other is much simpler. Don't wait for inspiration. It's a job. You write every day. You may not be able to, it may not be good what you've written that day, but you keep writing.
How many hours a day do you write?
I generally get to the library between 9 and 10, and they toss me out between 5 and 6.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's 4 hours. Finish this sentence. I'm most proud of.
Oh, this is such a vain thing to say. I can't say I'm most proud of my books, because I don't think they're great literature. I am proud of the fact that I write them, that I work at them, and that they touch some people. I'm very proud. If people come to me and they say that something in the book spoke to them, I'm so proud of that.
I don't think that's a vain thing to say at all. Thank you. One of my writing quirks is.
They're all quirks. I don't think I can answer that. Every process, like every writing process, is a quirk.
Okay. What's your favorite thing to do when you're not writing?
Reading, and I run in the park.
Are you listening to books when you're running, or music, or nothing?
I listen to music, but mainly I'm working. So I am writing. I mean, I'm working on character and plot, and it's great because I'm just in my head and there.
Right. One item you could never live without.
Something to write with, I guess. A laptop or a pen and paper.
Okay, there's a theme here. What is your favorite word?
Oh, there are too many.
Really? Okay, top 3 favorite words.
I don't know. It's very funny. Years ago, I was discussing something political with a friend, and I said compassion, and he said he hates that. I said, I hate that word. I said, I think it's not only is the meaning nice, I think the sound of it, compassion, is just lovely. So I guess we can choose that.
I like compassion. That's a good one. What dead writer would you most like to meet?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, because I'm, of course, a huge fan of Scott Fitzgerald. I mean, what American writer is not? On the other hand, I know he would be really unpleasant to be. he was a nasty drunk. I think perhaps Trollope, because I think he just has a fascinating understanding of character and power, and it would be so fascinating to talk to him.
Is there a living writer you'd like to meet?
I started to say she's not a writer I really like, but she's not living. She's not very well known. Now I'm drawing a complete blank. It's not, okay, no, I'm going to pass on that one because.
Okay, pass on that one. What is your favorite underappreciated novel?
And that's the one I was just going to mention. It's called Women in Black, by an Australian writer, and her last name is Sinclair. St. John's. No, that's why I couldn't do it. St. John's. Anyway.
Black novel. It's a novel.
It's a novel.
This is the beauty of being on a laptop while we do this. Oh, yeah. Madeline St. John.
Madeline, that's it. Madeline St. John. I couldn't think of it. I don't think she's living. I think she died recently. But it's just a beautiful little book that I stumbled upon. There's also a movie. There's an Australian movie of it. And it's just a lovely little book.
If you could travel back in time, what period would you go to?
World War II.
What are you reading now?
Well, I have to be very careful when I'm working what I'm reading, because that gets into your head. I just finished the new Elena Ferrante, The Line of Adults. I thought it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. What is the hardest thing about being a writer?
Rejection.
What's the best thing about being a writer?
As I said before, obviously a rave review makes you feel wonderful, but a personal, somebody saying that you really got through to them, that they were moved by this is, years ago I was doing a reading and a woman started to cry, and I didn't know this, I didn't see her, she was at the side, and someone told me later, I said, I didn't see that, and she said, well, it's good because she would have stopped. I said, are you kidding? I wouldn't have stopped. I would have loved that I was getting through to her.
What is your favorite novel of all time?
Probably Gatsby. Middlemarch runs a close second.
Thank you. That was it. You survived the lightning round.
Thank you.
Beth, I don't know if you're there, you're coming back, but I think you wanted to ask questions at 10 till.
Yes, thank you both, Ellen and Alice, for such an interesting and entertaining evening. It was great to find out more about Paris Never Leaves You and your writing style, Ellen. So thank you both for such an interesting and enjoyable conversation. We have in the chat box, the chat box is enabled, so please feel free to type in any questions you would like to ask Ellen or even Alice. And in the chat box, we have put the link to Paris Never Leaves You. If you click on the link, it'll take you to the page at the bookstore to purchase the paperback copy of Paris Never Leaves You. We also have the contact information for the bookstall up on the screen right now if you wanted the phone number or way to contact them through their website. And as we mentioned previously, if you are interested in purchasing a signed copy, you could pick it up at the store. The bookstore would also send it, or they'll deliver the books to the library and you can pick it up from the library. So let's see if we have any questions in the chat box. And well, here's a question for you, Ellen. For those in your audience not familiar with your work, if they tore through Paris Never Leaves You and they couldn't put it down, what title would you recommend that they read next from your body of work?
Oh, that's like asking you which is your favorite child.
That's part of the question.
Yeah, if it's the World War, if you want another World War II novel, there's one called Next to Love, which sounds romantic, but it's not. It's from a quote about World War I. So Next to Love is about war. Scottsboro is the one that I was shortlisted for the Orange Prize in the UK. So it's obviously, in a way, my favorite novel. And I was going to mention one more. I can't believe I'm drawing a blank on my own books, of which are the Next to Love, Scottsboro, Boy Who Loved Anne Frank is very popular, very different. Oh, and I knew, yes. And Terrible Virtue is a novel about Margaret Sanger. And I think in this day and age, it's a really important novel.
Thanks. Well, you gave us a lot of good book recommendations, and we also put your website up on the chat box. So I know that people can find out more about Paris Never Leaves You and all the other books that you mentioned and the few that you didn't mention. So if anyone wants to go to your website, it's ellenfeldman.com, but we also have the link to your website on our screen. And let's see, I'm not sure if there's any other questions at the moment. So if not, I will just thank you all again for joining us this evening, and for Ellen, thank you for participating in our Meet the Author series. It's our ongoing series. And Alice, thank you for leading such a great conversation. We really enjoyed the evening. So thank you to everybody, and good night.
Thank you. Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you. You're a wonderful conversationalist. Thank you, Alice. And thank you for arranging this. And thank you all for being there. Everyone's out there.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.